How did you go bankrupt? Bill asked. Two ways, Mike said. Gradually, then suddenly. The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway was writing about debt, but he could have been writing about empires, alliances, or the international order itself. The pattern is always the same. A system holds for so long that people stop noticing the stress. Small cracks appear, a treaty partner hedges its bets, an institution loses a funder, a satellite signal gets spoofed, and each one is dismissed as an anomaly. Not a trend, not yet. The system still looks solid from the outside. The meetings still happen, the flags still fly, and then one morning you wake up and realize the architecture has shifted underneath you. Welcome to Understandable Insights, Information to Intelligence with Sue Gordon, the national security podcast that gives you a competitive advantage, an elemental understanding of the world as it is, not how you prefer it to be. I'm Eric, joined each week by the Honorable Sue Gordon, and together we'll break down the headlines shaping our world, looking for patterns and early warning signs, and asking how we should be thinking and acting as citizens and leaders across the issues of intelligence, technology, and business. It's April 6th, 2026. Let's get to it. Hey, Sue, how are you?
I'm great, although about to enter the doldrums from a sports perspective because the NCAA basketball is almost over. I don't want to talk about my bracket, except that it reflected my fandom, except Duke and Texas didn't do as well as I'd hoped. But I watched UCLA beat South Carolina yesterday. What a great game. What a triumph of a senior-laden team. On the men's side, we don't get a chance to see old teams anymore. So much of the one-and-done era. This was the seniors who played. I think every point in the Final Four itself was scored by a senior on UCLA. But they were so joyful, and they routed South Carolina. I just think, who's been in four or five Final Fours recently. Just unbelievable. And it wasn't their day, but UCLA was awesome and fun team to watch, really joyful. But the other thing it reminded me of is that there have been great women's basketball players for a long time, even though these players are truly amazing. UCLA actually did win a national championship back in 1978 before women were allowed to be in the NCAA. That was the AIAW, the Association of Intercollegiate Athletics for Women. Anyway, they beat Maryland for the championship, and Ann Myers, who later married Don Drysdale, was the star player, and she was Caitlin Clark. There was talk of her joining an NBA team. It's really fun to watch these players. The second is I just got to give a shout out to the amazing work of national security professionals who rescued the downed pilot. And these are from Intel to the service members who performed the rescues, the planners. They're just days to really be proud of America. And this is one we never leave someone behind. I don't care whether it's Brittany Griner, who's been detained by the Russians, or whether it's a pilot. We leap tall buildings to go after our own, and it does distinguish us. And it feels like the professional cadre has been kind of maligned over the past few years, and this is just a reminder of how awesome they really are. And then the third thing that's on my mind, I was so lucky to do a hit on the Bulwark podcast with Sam Stein talking about Iran. Sam is a super interesting interviewer, really thoughtful, pulled great questions out. So to our listeners, tune into the Bulwark. Every media now has a perspective, but I think you'll find these folks really interesting. And they did a great shout out to me and our podcast. So great time.
Nice.
What are you thinking about since I have now once again consumed a lot of air?
No, the NPR this morning described the UCLA win as shellacking. We were also watching the downed aviators very closely in my house. My wife and I, who've spent a large portion of our adult life training and leading that mission to recover downed aircrew and personnel, it was very close to our heart. So very proud and relieved that person was rescued. And shout out to the Bulwark, great podcast. Y'all did a great job, and looking to tune in and continue listening to them. Well, what are we talking about today?
Yeah, so over the past year, we've been tracking a set of slow-moving shifts, the erosion of alliance reliability, the hollowing out of multinational institutions, and the militarization of information and infrastructure. We've touched each of these threads individually. China's strategic investment in the Global South during COP30 in Blimp, the AI policy framework and state preemption debate, worldwide threat assessment hearing. We've talked about them all. But this week gave us 4 signals that, taken together, tell a coherent story about the world is heading. And they're a little bit under the radar from some of the other signals. Look at that. Look what I did there. Signals under the radar. We're going to talk about our closest allies openly hedging their security bets. We're going to talk about the institutions that have been built to run the world are fading a bit. We're going to talk about infrastructure, information, cyber, GPS that has become the real battlefield. And we're going to talk about strange signals from beyond science and the natural world. Then the thesis is that the systems that were once organized around the world are weakening, and countries are quietly improvising alternatives. So I think we'll touch on each of those. And then, just as a apropos of nothing, I was struck by the president's now infamous truth posting on Easter. And I talk a lot about leadership, and I think this is a great example of the president isn't representing himself, even though he uses his name. The president is representing the country and the institutions behind it. And when he speaks, he's speaking on behalf of all of us, and it's our power. So in a moment when allies are already questioning American steadiness, that responsibility matters. Leadership matters, voice matters. Leaders speak on behalf of their countries. And I think we're feeling it, that people are no longer just seeing it as the individual President Donald J. Trump, but more and more reflective of this is where the United States is. And I think that matters. And I think it's a signal.
All right, let's get to it. So we're going to start with allies quietly hedging. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte will meet with President Donald Trump on Wednesday. This meeting comes at a time when European governments are openly discussing security structures independent of NATO after U.S. threats to withdraw from the alliance. Well, that's not new. On March 2nd, French President Emmanuel Macron unveiled what he called, quote, forward deterrence, a new doctrine offering France's nuclear umbrella to 7 European countries: Germany, Poland, Belgium, Denmark, Greece, the Netherlands, and Sweden. This includes partner participation in French nuclear exercises and the potential temporary deployment of French nuclear-armed fighter jets to partner nations. It's the first expansion of a European nuclear deterrent since the Cold War. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz responded by acknowledging openly what leaders used to only say in private. There is a profound sense among Europeans that the United States will no longer uphold NATO's mutual defense commitment unconditionally. Germany won't build its own nukes. It can't under the 2+4 treaty and the NPT, but Merz is courting Macron's offer and exploring how European nations might share the costs and posture of an independent deterrent. It's not just Europe. Asian partners worry the Iran war is diverting U.S. military attention from the Indo-Pacific, creating opportunities for China. Polling from the Washington Post says that diplomatic conversations show the U.S. being viewed more as a transactional partner than a dependable ally, something you've been talking about all year, Sue. You've watched the transatlantic relationship evolve over decades. Is this European hedging a symptom of temporary political volatility in the U.S., or does it signal a deeper shift? Before this latest war in Iran, I wonder if many leaders weren't just hoping to weather the storm of this administration, but you identified the shift immediately after Davos with the change in language from both Prime Minister Carney of Canada and Steer of the UK.
We have been talking about this a lot, and Eric, I think alliances are a little like marriages. If one partner starts acting in an unpredictable fashion, the other one quietly opens a separate bank account. They don't immediately leave. So I think what Europe is doing is they're not leaving NATO. They're creating backup plans, and they're hedging because our predictability is declining. And to your question about is just a shift or from waiting out the president, I think we saw the shift early. I think they wanted to wait out the president. I really do. I think they wanted to be like, oh, it's going to come around. I think they tried to wait him out during tariffs. So you balance this with their first reaction to the tariffs was saying, okay, we're going to try and do things. We're going to let things change. We're going to push back a little bit, but we're going to stay in the fray. And it mostly worked out for them until it didn't. And then the Davos speech, and then now this. So I think they're building redundancy is the best way I could say it. If you add up the tariffs and Greenland and the 51st state and Venezuela, they were all signals that they saw and started working. And so now we're seeing like real preparedness. They were prepared, right? They were prepared to say, nope, we're not joining in. They were prepared to say, no, you can't use our bases or our overflights. And I think their readiness to be so decisive is that it wasn't that they were mad. It's that they were like, yeah, we've seen this. We know where it's going. We're not going to play. So I think that's interesting. The other thing I think is really interesting is that even leaders who had been relatively sympathetic, that's the best word I could use, to President Trump, like Italy's Giorgia Meloni, they're now drawing boundaries about what they'll support. So even his most ardent, most right-wing, we're with you, are doing it. Now, on your point about Macron's proposal, it is historically significant and historically important. U.S. nuclear umbrella has basically held for 70 years. And it has led to European strategic restraint in a weird sort of way, right? When you have relatively few powers with nuclear weapons and you're saying we're going to protect you, then it keeps the world in check. And so we've talked about this before too. The world order that has held for the longest time, well, it is not what it was. I think what we're waiting to see is what's going to emerge in its place. And I think the question that particularly our European partners are saying, not whether they want to join in, it's whether the United States has any interest in being a leader anymore. This nuclear deterrent is probably the most profound of the signals we're seeing.
What does that signal to partners in Asia, the Middle East, and the global South who are watching to see where the wind blows? And how does it impact our Asia and Indo-Pacific alliances?
What's happening in Asia is perhaps a more profound, albeit slightly quieter and not as strident as what's happening in Europe. You have Japan's new prime minister, right when she was elected, Prime Minister Takaichi. There was some love bombing going on between the president of the United States and Japan's prime minister. They were on the same page. They visited, they talked about all sorts of stuff. And Japan is really, because they're so dependent on the United States, they are super careful about public disagreement. But what you're seeing is now the prime minister gently turning, saying that they'll have to decide. And part of it is how unpopular this war is in Japan. And so she has to manage her political environment as well. So if Japan is reticent to throw their lots in with us, in a way, that's an even stronger signal, just given the historical significance and how polite and quiet they typically are. It is not a good signal for us in terms of our allies not only preparing for, and that signals that we're losing at best predictability, and at worst, we're losing their trust. But the second is, if you move into Asia, you now have everybody deciding that they need to make contingency plans, whether it's the U.S. doesn't want to lead or the U.S. is going to throw anyone under the bus when it suits our purpose. And I think I've said it before, my whole career, our greatest advantage was our allies and partners. I don't know that they believe they can count on us. And as a consequence, it doesn't feel like we are including them in the same way that we used to. And there's a big ripple effect.
Yeah, Australia too. They were one of our great partners in the global war on terror. They spent a lot of energy and resources in Afghanistan alongside us. And Prime Minister Albanese, I think last week or a couple weeks ago, was like, whoa, 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 because President Trump came out and said, Australia's not helping either. And he was like, whoa, bring us into this. We disagree with this idea. We wish you would have talked to us about it, but we're also not getting in your way kind of thing, to paraphrase.
In the weirdest way, that is, for me, the strangest juxtaposition. We didn't include anybody. We just made this move by ourselves. And I can't tell you how weird that is. I've seen lots of run-ups to lots of events. And the professional cadre picks up the phone and talks to all their counterparts. We just don't surprise our friends. And so that this was such a surprise. And then it turns all of a sudden when it's not going as well as we might hope, we turn it to say that they weren't there for us. Even that communications thread, while you can say, sure, that's what we would do, just is very unsettling to alliances. So we'll see how this plays out.
Yeah, interesting to watch. But part of that is also the disappearing institutions, right?
Right.
You alluded to this already. The post-World War II institutional order of the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, the WHO. Those were all designed to be permanent scaffolding. And the idea was pretty simple. If you give every country a seat, a vote, and a stake in the system survives. For 80 years, that has held, and the institutions were imperfect, slow, often frustrating, and very governmental, but they provided predictability, and that predictability is what markets, alliances, and development plans needed to function. So the scaffolding is now being disassembled, primarily by us, the country that built it. In January 2026, the United States announced its withdrawal from 66 international organizations, including 31 UN entities. This followed the effective dismantling of USAID through DOGE, and into the vacuum, others step. We saw this at COP30 in Belém last November, and in episode 19, we discussed that. With the United States absent from the UN Climate Summit for the first time in 3 decades, China dominated with its full-court sales press. Its pavilion commanded the entrance hall. Its clean energy executives presented to large audiences in English. We've talked about China's substitution, not partnership approach before, Sue, and that seems to be what's happening at this institutional level now. From an intelligence perspective, though, I'm curious what institutional withdrawal cost us in terms of access and signal. When the U.S. is no longer in the room where norms are negotiated, standards are set, and information is shared, how does that affect our ability to see what's coming next?
So hold that thought. Let me bounce up 1 second. And this is a very first Trump administration signal. And we talked about it in terms of what happens when you have a world ruled by economic considerations and a president that sees everything as leverage. This president, for as much as he cites history, like we're doing the best ever, it was really hard to get second and third order effects put on the table when there was some immediate action to be taken. And in a weird sort of way, that's the friction that has made our institutions work so well, policy and bureaucracy. It's really this friction that says, yeah, I know you want that, but you got to have it for a long time. And that is not a hallmark of this presidency, especially when most of the considerations are economic. So we talked about in the very first episode of this new year, we talked about what the president's actions reveal about his strategy. This is one of them coming home to roost. It isn't just a pattern that you see in international relations. Isn't this fundamentally the same thing we're seeing when it comes to research funding? Where, why should I pay for that? That looks like wasted money because none of that seems like it's important today. That's right. It's not important today. It's 30 years from now. So just this is a hallmark and a belief of this president. So back to intelligence, because that's a really great question. The thing you mostly lose, I don't know who first said this to me, we lose the ability to eavesdrop politely. I mean, so, you know, multilateral institutions are giant listing posts, right? You hear priorities forming long before they become policy. And institutional withdrawal isn't symbolic, changes how intelligence works. We have, and I have 3 points on that. Of course I do, because that's what I do. We have less visibility. These organizations are massive information exchanges. You learn about priorities and grievances and technology direction and coalition building. And so when you leave the room, you lose a lot of informal signals. Think about all the institutions that you mentioned, just the ones you mentioned that we have left. The UN, IMF, World Bank, WTO, World Health Organization, the International Standards Organization, the International Telecommunications Union. Us being in those rooms is super important. Us as a nation not being present means that we don't get to go and just sit and listen and look like we're a member of the delegation. So you're losing a lot of informal signals. The second is we have less ability to influence the agenda. these standards bodies that I was talking about, they decide things like digital governance and climate finance rules and telecommunications norms and development lending practices. And whoever sets the rules shapes the market. It used to be that the US government didn't want much influence on global standards because we had so much control of the technology and the systems and the leadership that the government didn't have to do the work. The private sector was doing so much with our developments. All the other countries have figured out we can move into this leadership roles and we can shape, and it's really happening. We'll give a couple of examples. And then the last is there's less coalition building. I talk about partnership. I know I'm a broken record. You're going to accuse me of being a liberal globalist or something like that. But the truth is, I'm America first all the way. And the only way America has succeeded is because of these partnerships that have allowed us, just by our involvement, even more than our dollars and our power, to allow like-minded nations with similar values to coalesce and to feel like they could be big and strong because they had our imprimatur. It's just so myopic, Eric. It is just so myopic. We were like so far ahead in terms of understanding the big geopolitical play of free and open societies and just how much we influenced by being who we were. And now this idea that we're measuring whether it's good on whether it benefits us financially in the short haul is just shocking to me. And more importantly, strategically, it's denying us some of the access that we had, to use our words, signals. And the other thing is giving us much less influence because people are figuring out how to exert theirs differently from ours.
Yeah, for sure. I'm not mad about considering ROI, return on investment, in all these conversations,
Sure.
but I am upset about the soft power implications and not looking at it through a long-term lens. The ability to detect those early warning signs, right? To eavesdrop politely, like you said, you're providing that presence around the world through some of these organizations.
It's a lot like what you and I said. Listen, our government is too big, wastes too much money, and certainly needed to be reimagined in the environment in which we now stand. But the approach that was taken to just say, based on the titles of things, we can cut that money, that has not left us stronger. So again, I'm totally with you. We should not be wasting time or money. But then reimagine and reinvest in the relationship differently. Don't just say, yeah, we're not there.
Yep. We're also asking about China more specifically being that default voice in global governance. So, setting those technology standards, climate rules, develop financing terms. What does that mean for the competitive landscape in emerging markets? Part of our national security strategy was to invest, and the State Department was going to be kind of our eyes for investments in developing nations around the world. But what does this say, and does it contradict that a little bit?
I think so. There's this old saying that says China doesn't storm institutions, it redecorates them. In other words, they keep the structure, but they change the agenda and they do it over a long time. So China's approach, and again, we're juxtaposing China's approach with a simultaneously withdrawal of the United States. So you're creating a push and pull that aren't friction anymore, that are actually each one enhancing the other. So China's approach is substitution, then they set the agenda, and then they create dependency. And they step in when Western institutions and companies withdraw. And I think there are four easy domains to look at, whether that's developmental finance, the Belt and Road Initiative, that basically had China sweep across the global south. And what they do is they come in and they offer refinancing of debt. And then they say, we'll maintain it for you. Then we'll give you some future capital. And then all of a sudden you see trade flowing through Chinese infrastructure. And in one of the justifications for the Don Road Doctrine, or the reclaiming of the Western Hemisphere and the move on Venezuela, was the fact that China and Russia had moved into the global south. And he wasn't wrong about that. It's just that action was not necessarily the one that was going to counter this initiative. So one, development finance. I've talked about this before. I lived it in my last few years in the intelligence community, the telecommunications infrastructure. The move of China's Huawei and the creation of a digital Silk Road I'll tell you what, if your telecom backbone is built by a Chinese firm, your digital ecosystem is dependent on Chinese technology. They moved in even into underserved areas in the United States who couldn't afford the telecommunications technologies of Ericsson or Samsung or others. Huawei stepped in and said, "We can give you broadband in rural Alabama." And what are they supposed to do about it? So telecommunications infrastructure was another one. And they certainly subordinate themselves into the International Telecommunications Union. Something else you and I talked about is rare earth processing. Through their dominance in rare earths, China has incredible supply chain leverage. 90% of rare earth minerals for electric vehicles and wind turbines and defense electronics and semiconductors is controlled by China. And we haven't even talked about pharmaceuticals. And if we withdraw from the World Health Organization and we leave that leadership to China, how do those two things, coupled with a weakening posture in the World Trade Organization, change the market for pharmaceuticals and then global standards bodies? Influence doesn't disappear when America withdraws. It just transfers to somebody else who has recognized the strategic value, and we're certainly seeing with China. And they are capable and intentional and patient.
Yeah. And this idea of infrastructure as the new battlefield. On March 30th, The Guardian reported on a classified State Department cable signed by Secretary of State Rubio, directing U.S. embassies and consulates worldwide to launch coordinated information warfare campaigns on social media. The cable instructs embassies to recruit local influencers, academics, and community leaders to counter what administration calls, quote, anti-American propaganda. It specifically endorses Musk's X platform and its community notes feature as tools for pushing back against foreign government narratives. And critically, it directs State Department personnel to coordinate directly with the U.S. military's psychological operations units. To the best of my knowledge, it did not mention the men who stare at goats, but we're still looking into that. Everyone knows diplomacy needs a good marketing strategy. The approach is designed to make America-funded narratives feel locally organic rather than centrally directed. And this is happening against a broader backdrop of infrastructure becoming the primary domain of state competition. GPS spoofing incidents are affecting commercial aircraft across the Mideast and South Asia. Cheap jamming tools now allow state and non-state actors to disrupt satellite navigation with minimal funding. War on the Rocks published a piece in February called When GPS Goes Dark, arguing we need to build a force that can navigate without satellite systems. Completely agree. Cyber operations are targeting electrical grids and communication systems, and the battlefield isn't geographic anymore. It's informational, digital, and infrastructure. So this is some of the gray zone stuff, Sue, we talk about. It's becoming increasingly prevalent and soon to be formalized. You probably know best the difference between influence and covert action. Is that diplomacy, intelligence, a best practice, or just old hat? Y'all been doing this forever.
I guess the answer is it's some of each. So influence activity has always existed, and we're not the only purveyors. The Soviet Union was great at it, and they continue to be. And so influence activity has always existed. I think there are a couple things that are really interesting about the set of things that you mentioned. So let's talk about gray zone. And I've defined gray zone before, and I'll say it again. I think this is just my personal version, and that is gray zone is that which exists outside the standards and norms that typically govern activity. So law of armed conflict and the things that have generally, when you go into formalized war, we're seeing more and more areas. And what's so great is you can step into it. There just isn't anything to govern it. And so the first person in can usually set the rules. So let's think about all these areas that you mentioned that are now not particularly well defined by policy or standards and norms. In a way, the United States was almost puritanical in the past, where we tended to overuse, my word, prior norms to constrain us from doing things like spoofing GPS because we were afraid of the spillover effects into civil society, which we tried to avoid like the
Yeah.
plague. So one of the things about covert action is it has to be supported by a presidential finding. And that is you are going to do something to hide the hand of the U.S. government. That's what covert action is. Different from military operations, which is, hey, we're here. We got flags on our
Right.
sleeves. Then you must have a presidential finding. Is there a presidential finding to support all these things? And what's important about a presidential finding is not that it's like somehow magical, but it does require you and the institution, since that's what we're talking about today, it does require you to actually consider what you're doing. And if you think about one of the biggest things we've talked about the whole year is it feels like, yes, the institutions are slow, but now what we have is an administration that is choosing speed over that friction, and we're seeing some of the effects. So I think influence isn't new. In that litany of things that you described, where is the craft to make sure that you don't have spillover? For example, I always said that there was a natural constraint on the use of biological warfare more than there was a constraint on the use of chemical warfare besides the international treaties, and that is, boy, it is really hard to predict the coupling effects in living systems. Like, once you launch something, man, we don't understand it well enough, and so that was always a natural constraint. In some ways, that's been a constraint on cyber, and as we've developed institutions to say, "Let's think about those effects," we had some constraints. The things you mentioned, who's conducting them? What authority? What process? So I think what's really interesting about it is that our institutions have always included persuasion. What do you think Voice of America was? But it was being done almost in an open, constrained way. Embassies have always supported media and promoted narratives and funded civil society. So in a way, none of that's new. But the integration with digital platforms is, and we've talked about what that does in terms of reach and volume. I also think we're seeing some real blurring of traditional lines between diplomacy, intelligence, and military information operations without the coordination that led it in the past. So you're gonna have an embassy on their own work with an influencer in a local region. Is anything local anymore? So I think that's one of the most interesting things about this whole set is not that the idea of it is new, and not even that the modalities are slightly different. It's that where are the norms to keep pace with the advance?
Yeah. I think information operations is a scary term. It implies like psychological coercion and making people do things against their will, right? We're listening to Stairway to Heaven backwards and it's subliminally telling you to do something. You could also frame this as just global outreach, right? And we just talked about elements of soft power and how we've left a lot of those organizations. But this is another avenue and opportunity for one of our soft power organizations, our State Department, to get out there and spread goodwill and a positive message, collaborating with local leaders in their area. But I am concerned to your point of giving each embassy out there on an island its own room to determine all this. You're going to have some really great and nested organizational results, but you're also going to have some head scratchers, I expect.
I think that's kind of a persistent themes of ours. The whats aren't too scary. The hows matter a lot, and the outcome is something that we don't always articulate before we're like, "Oh, I could do that." So I take your point as really super valid, is that on the surface, we've done it for a long time and we actually want to do it. But like I said, I worry a lot about our standards and norms haven't kept up with it. So real easy to get over our skis in an unhelpful way in a world that is always already disrupted.
That's true. Yeah. It's like the strategic corporal. You're delegating to that person to make those decisions, and then you got to trust that they're going to make the right ones.
Yeah, and so just to go on, because I'm in the mood to be really proud of ours, I think as an intelligence officer, one of the most tremendous advantages that the US has historically had is the training, discipline, and culture that we insist on where we do invest in our corporals, and so they are able to execute judgment. If you send people without, whether that's to Minnesota or whether that's to an embassy, with a mission without that training and foundation that says it's your judgment we're counting on rather than expecting to be able to either delineate all the rules or there are none. I think that's really problematic in a fast-moving world that we have right now, and so it's been one of our great advantages. I'd prefer it if we not give it away.
Yeah, we also talked in episode 33 about the national security strategy, making those embassies aware of the business opportunities. But for tech companies whose platforms are being instrumental in this, X, for example, but any other platform that's user generated content. So, what kind of responsibilities do they have? And what happens to their platform credibility when community notes becomes a tool of this statecraft?
Yeah, we've talked ad nauseum about this shift in national security from government-centric to everyone's responsibility, from CEOs to citizens. I mean, one, that's what we're doing here at Understandable Insights, is trying to give practical national security information to those other national security decision makers. But I think it's slow on the uptake. And actually, this is a great case study. If the US is doing it, we're usually the last ones to the party because we have typically cared about civilian casualties. If we go in whole hog and we've now created this blurring between government and private industry, between industry and citizens, cats and dogs living together, mass hysteria. This is a great example of, I don't think we could shake our fists at the cosmos and want a simpler environment. We're not putting this genie back in the bottle, but I think we do have to spend some effort at some big picture standards, norms, rules of the road, culture, whatever word you want to use for it. And we're living in a world where everyone seems to be able to get what they can, and I don't see who's worried about the big pictures, is especially the time that the big picture stuff is showing its wear and tear. I think this is an issue to watch, and I think this segment particularly is one of those that whatever subsequent generations, we're gonna have to figure out what to do about this because the world's running faster and the constraints are getting less useful and less useful.
Yep. Careful what you wish for, because
Yep.
Elon's answer is going to be free speech, bro. Say what you want.
Say what you want.
Speaking of the cosmos, I'm going to talk about some strange signals from space now. First, interstellar objects. 3I Atlas, the third known interstellar object ever detected, tore through our solar system at 130,000 miles per hour last fall. More recently, researchers analyzing NASA's Fireball catalog discovered evidence of a swarm of approximately 35 million meter-scale interstellar objects orbiting within Earth's path around the Sun, including one detected over Barents Sea in the Arctic. Second, the Sun itself. We're at or near the peak of solar cycle 25, and solar activity is elevated. Coronal mass ejections, solar flares, geomagnetic storms. These events disrupt satellite communication, degrade GPS accuracy, and can damage power grid infrastructure. You've said recently that we should be more worried about Mother Nature affecting our power grid than a deliberate EMP. In a world increasingly dependent on satellite navigation, GPS spoofing, and space-based communication, and then we'll talk about third, the Arctic. As sea ice retreats, the Arctic is becoming more and more accessible and contested. Russia has the world's largest icebreaker fleet. China has declared itself a, quote, near Arctic state. And a new optical ground station is being installed in western Greenland, the most northerly in the world, providing access to satellites and polar orbits. So the race for space dominance is shifting north, including our conversations about Golden Dome developments you mentioned last week. So from an intelligence and strategic planning perspective, how do you account for environmental variables like solar activity and Arctic access when building national security strategy? A Carrington-level solar event could take out satellite communications and GPS for a week. September 1st through 2nd, 1859 was the most intense geomagnetic storm in recorded history. British astronomer Richard Carrington observed a massive solar flare, and roughly 18 hours later, a coronal mass ejection slammed into Earth's magnetic field. Telegraph systems across Europe and North America failed. Some operators reported sparks flying from equipment, telegraph paper catching fire, and in some cases, the systems continued transmitting even after being disconnected from the power supplies. The sun operates on approximately an 11-year cycle called the solar cycle, where its magnetic activity ramps up to a peak, a solar maximum, and then quiets back down to a solar minimum. We're currently in solar cycle 25, which began in December of 2019 and has significantly more active than forecasters originally predicted. The cycle exists because the sun's magnetic field flips polarity at roughly every 11 years. As it builds towards the flip, the magnetic activity intensifies, meaning more sunspots, solar flares, and coronal mass ejections. So, how do we plan for this from a strategic planning perspective? And how do environmental variables like solar activity build into our national security strategy?
So, first things first, man, I just loved that. That was awesome. So, thanks for
S-
that.
Science Day.
Science Day, I'm going to reuse a line that said, we spend a lot of time worrying about adversaries taking down our systems. The sun can do it for free. And so I want to hit 2 points we've made before. Number one is national security planning. 100% takes these things into effect, from solar weather to Arctic geography to space infrastructure to climate to weather events. And we know the national security community knows all these. I mean, they do really. They know all the things you talked about. And a major solar storm, for example, can take out GPS and satellite comms. So, from a national security and intelligence perspective, strategists model environmental disruptions along with military threats and intelligence collection. There's weather satellites go along with our collection satellites to be able to predict what they're flying into and what they know. The reason why national security space systems cost so much is because they have to be reliable and available in order to do the mission. And so this is a huge consideration in terms of having the systems for national security in place when we need them, and it's why things cost so much. Now, what's really interesting about that aspect is, what have we talked about on this show as well? We've talked about the move toward commercial systems for national security, which has all sorts of advantages in terms of availability and automatic upgrades and cost. Are all those commercial systems as reliable and available? Or if they were, wouldn't they cost as much as some of the others? And so, how do we balance those two things? Like, I love commercial systems, but are they ever going to be more than a nice to have? Are we always going to have to harden our systems? We usually think about hardening in terms of nuclear activity, but harden them against these things. So I think it's a huge consideration. Not just is it true that we consider it, but the second is, how does that affect what we acquire and the reliability when we need it in unexpected events? And the second thing is, I'd be lying if I haven't said that some of the issues that have historically been looked at in terms of geopolitical events, things that might cause crisis, to how we plan for weather events, has been how many random climate units have been disbanded because we don't like the words climate change anymore. And so some of these things that seem like they're low probability, arcane topics actually turn out to be super important. And the landscape on how we apply them is changing. So that's from the intelligence national security perspective. The other perspective is the one I've talked about, the U.S. resilience civilly, which turns out to be incredibly important, is not managed in the same way, is not funded in the same way, is not as reliable in the same way as national security systems. But what we learned, whether it's through Kerrville or some of the other events, pandemics, what happens locally and what we're expecting our state and local to do is to account for these things. Where's the infrastructure that's going to allow that? What kind of resources do they need to buff up? And if you extrapolate from the talk the president gave right around Easter, when he's saying, hey, we can't be affording daycare and healthcare. We at the federal government have got to be able to plan for wars and other kinds of national security. Same thing applies to planning against natural events, which is in fact the real threat to anything that is governed by electricity. So really important stuff. And again, since one of the things we're trying to do is to help our listeners, when they hear these things, think about why it matters, and then hopefully go and try and understand where their state and local budgets are being affected and the decisions that our national lawmakers are making for us.
We haven't talked about Greenland in a few weeks. And at the time, there were not many signals to suggest China was an imminent threat in the Arctic, but they've called themselves near Arctic state since Xi Jinping in 2017 first made that comment, and then they formalized it in China's 2018 Arctic policy in a white paper called the Polar Silk Road. So how do you see kind of China's presence here in April of 2026 in the Arctic?
Yeah, so the Arctic is, the new bacon. All the Arctic countries are figuring out what they need to do, part affected by changing climate and part just recognition that's an important economic area as well. What China's saying is they're just positioning themselves strategically, right? It is strategic messaging. They're saying we consider this region part of the global commons we intend to shape. And if you look at what they've done in the global south, if others aren't watching, they are going to find a way to invest to do it. And there are all the things that we've talked about before the Arctic is important for, whether it's missile warning or communications network or shipping routes or resource access. China's message is, oh no, we have intentioned to declare that. And, these are the people that built new islands in Southeast Asia. So
Right. Yeah.
yeah, I think we ought to pay attention to their intention as well.
Worth noting.
Yep.
Well, we talked about a lot today. What do you want folks to walk away from this episode remembering or not misunderstand?
Pretty simply, the thread across all four of these areas is the same. The systems that organize the world, that for every listener's lifetime, whether those are alliances or institutions or norms or even the physical infrastructure, are weakening, and not suddenly and not dramatically, but quietly. And in the space where those systems used to operate, countries, and in some cases non-government, non-state actors, are improvising. Allies are hedging, institutions are fading, information warfare is becoming routine, and the natural world is rewriting the map. So I'll just say again, the world isn't collapsing, it's quietly rewiring itself, and the leaders who see the new wiring first will have the advantage. I hope it's us.
What else are you watching?
Oh my gosh, Eric, I'm watching all of it. Iran for sure. I have no idea. And again, I'll just say the information environment is so fraught. You and I are pretty steely eyed understanders of this world. And everything I hear, I have to go and do research to try and figure out whether,
Yeah.
and it
Yeah.
doesn't matter, almost independent of the source. I don't know any of it. So I think that's hard. So, Iran, this feels fraught. Listen to my Bulwark hit and the last time we talked about it. The U.S. is powerful. It is. We can act. Question is, what outcome are we trying to achieve, and can we get out once we're there? I'm watching the Supreme Court. This birthright citizen thing is really interesting. I'm watching Congress to see what happens with the SAVE Act. So I'm watching all of it. How about you?
Yeah, watching all of that. We'll see what happens. Big deadline looming now on bridges and power plants. We'll see how all that plays out. Watching the markets, see how they keep responding. It's been a lot of up and down. Maybe some of
Weird.
that's buy the dip, but hard to price in all this risk, right? But I also want to say happy trails, in the words of the PTI guys. Happy trails to the CIA World Factbook. The program ended on February 4th. It was founded back in 1975, and according to Politico, in addition to becoming useful to students, it held geopolitical influence, showing off America's intelligence capabilities to the former Soviet Union and other enemies. And being included in it could confer legitimacy upon a nation or an opposition party. In their farewell address, the CIA advised to stay curious. So helped me on many papers and research projects, many folks across the years and Model UN and stuff like that. Thank you, CIA World Factbook, Fair Winds and Following Seas.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up. Was it my last gig? No, next to last gig at the CIA was the director of support, and we had the honor of doing the publication, whether it was the President's Daily Brief or the World Factbook. And I remember going down to our printing press at the night shift and talking to the folks there. And I was asking this guy that had been there for 40 years, and I said, "What's great about the job?" And he said, "Oh, man, I know what's happening before anyone else does in the world." And it was true of current intelligence, but it was also true of the Factbook. You can still find copies of it. With the rate the world's turning, it won't be universally valid, but I love their admonishment to stay current, and I will miss its presence. That's for sure.
Well, that's what we're watching and how we see it. Thank you for joining us, and no doubt there's more to come. This country's strength isn't in its power, industry, or government, but in its people.
As Eric says, thank you for joining us. We always want to hear what you think about our direction, focus, and insights. We're doing it for you. Join us next week and each week for the Understandable Insights podcast, wherever you listen. And as always, go forth, do good, and for goodness sakes, be kind to one another. It makes all the difference.